Queen was finally put to rest yesterday, but unfortunately, all the morons are out. In force. This is the Great White North Report. I'm in love with the system. Never going home. I'm in love. Alright, so yesterday I watched some of the proceedings of the funeral march and everything. And not so much the actual service, but more of the in-between stuff. The march down from the Abbey to Windsor Castle. Saw the vigil of the princes and the vigil of the grandchildren, which I thought was pretty moving. But of course, with all that stuff and all the people you see in the crowds and all the flowers and gifts that they lay out and well-wishers and mourners, you also get all the idiots. Little people who will never be known. And then you have this one. For some Africans, the Queen will always be tied to centuries of colonialism and slavery. So they're talking about the colonial past of England and of the British Empire and its connections with slavery, which only lasted for 150 years in terms of Africa. Slavery had existed before in Britain itself during the Celtic, Roman, Anglo-Saxon periods. And let's face it, slavery has existed all around the world. Korea got rid of slavery in 1910, and it was the Japanese that forced the Koreans to get rid of slavery, because Koreans were enslaving Koreans. But then the Japanese treated the Koreans like second-class citizens and treated them like shit, which is beyond another point entirely, but you get the idea. This article by Idil Musa is talking about Canada's African diaspora. Canada, at its peak, had less than 1,000 slaves, and not for very long. We got rid of them fairly early in the 19th century. Now, the grievous harm suffered by Africans during centuries of slavery and colonialism. So they're criticizing the monarchy. So this guy, Ronaldo Walcott, professor of Black Cultural Studies, says the Queen and the monarchy represent to me the ongoing brutal history of colonization. Alright. Almost any black nation in the world has been touched by the British Empire continues to be at the bottom of every global measure possible. What it means is that even though they've achieved independence, they have still not done anything with it. You cannot blame the monarchy and the British Empire for all your woes of today. When people were freed back then, they were grateful, even though they had very little. And of course, they're going on with all this stuff about how Cecil Rhodes and stuff that never even happened here. So they're going out of context with Africa itself. But there are some Africans that say mourn the Queen, which is good. But Idil Musa, she seems to be projecting that we should get rid of the monarchy and the Queen is at fault. I've also seen one thing on CBC Radio where they're asking for reparations. Britain should make reparations for all former descendants of slaves, which is just ludicrous. First of all, these people should be asking how they got to be slaves in the first place. This guy is with the Ronaldo Walcott's with the Black Cultural Studies. Well, has he not studied how slavery came to exist in Africa? Has he forgotten? Well, it's existed forever. The Romans got slaves from Africa, so did the Persians, so did the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians. So it's nothing new. What they forget is that Britain did not go into Africa and just take people and just steal people. They actually bought them. So that means they were already previously captured. Let that sink in for a minute. Who captured them? Well, if you look at it this way, let's say the Benin raided into the Ijibu area and started capturing people. It was common for African kingdoms to war upon each other and make raids, and they would capture slaves. Some of these slaves they would keep for themselves. Others they would sell. Now, who were they selling them to? Let that sink in. They were selling them to the Islamic Muslim traders. Muslim traders had been penetrating Africa for centuries before the Europeans ever did. And they had a monopoly on the slave trade in the interior of Africa. So the Muslims were actually buying slaves from African kingdoms and then taking these slaves to the West African ports or to the East African ports of Zanzibar or even North Africa into the Barbary coast and into Egypt and then selling them. The Arab trans-Saharan slave trade. The East and Central African Arab slave trade out of East Africa. It had been existing for hundreds of years, almost 1,300 years, prior to colonialism. It was nothing new. In fact, it still exists today. So for any descendants of slaves, they should be looking at that. Why not go after the source? Ask for reparations for all these little African kingdoms or the Arab slave trades. Not saying that the British weren't responsible for anything, but they were. But think about it. White people weren't penetrating the interior of Africa to pick slaves. They would have died from all sorts of diseases. It wasn't until better medicine in the mid-1900s that whites could go into the interior. So basically, it was black people stealing other black people, selling them to the Muslim merchants, and the Muslim merchants would drive them to the coast and sell them to the white people on the Atlantic coast. Thence they were sent overseas to the Caribbean. Don't forget that the Barbary pirates on the coast of Morocco, Algeria, were sending slave raids up into Ireland and even Iceland, taking people. So there are white slaves as well. Slaves also from the northern Mediterranean, captured by Barbary pirates and the Ottomans. The Balkans, Russia. A lot of white people were also sent down. No one ever talks about it. Because it's the monarchy and the British Empire, they love to talk about this, but they don't want to hear the whole picture. So Islam, they don't ignore it, nor do they condemn it. In fact, a large part of the Sharia is dedicated to the practice. Now, a Muslim friend will tell you that, oh, it's all humane and stuff. Slavery is never humane. Muslims are encouraged to live the way of Muhammad, who was a slave owner and a trader of slaves. He captured slaves in battle, he had sex with his slaves, and he instructed his men to do the same. The Quran, and I've read 4 different ones, Hafs, Warsh, Nafi, and Ibn Kathir's, devotes more verses to making sure that Muslim men know they can keep women as sex slaves than it does to telling them to pray 5 times a day. And it gives a list of the Quran ones, the Quranic sources. The Sunnahs and the Sirahs and Hadiths are even worse. So let's go back. 10 little known stories about how slavery ended around the world. Britain spent most of its budget paying off slave owners. You gotta remember, Britain spent a lot of its wealth and power stopping the transatlantic slave trade. In the late 1700s, early 1800s. They abolished it outright in 1833. It took a while, and the biggest concern was the slave owners. They had to pay them off. 40% of their treasurer's annual income. And they had to go to £15 million in debt to pay for it. And they finished paying off that debt in 2015. So that's 182 years later. Now, of course, the slaves didn't see a penny of it but they were freed. Their life might not have been all that much better because they spent most of their time staying on the same plantation for minimum wages. Canada abolished slavery to save a single woman. I actually read, when I was in the Niagara Peninsula last week, and I read the historical plaque for Governor General Simcoe, who personally made it his goal to save the woman. He couldn't do it, so he changed the law. Slavery was illegal in Upper Canada, but it only banned the purchase of new slaves and the ones they had. But it died out soon after. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to keep slaves. And it was the British Empire that pressured them into giving it up. Yeah, let that one sink in. Slavery revolt in Haiti actually worked. First black president of Mexico abolished slavery. Good for him. Britain forced Zanzibar, which was a Muslim state, to abolish slavery in under an hour. That's the British Empire using their influence and power to force another country to give up slavery. It took 2 wars to end the Barbary white slave trade. The Americans did in 1801 and 1815. The British, Dutch, and French fought with Algiers off and on for nearly 100 years before the Ottoman Empire. 1890 finally signed an agreement to stop taking white slaves. Let that one sink in. Cuba ignored Spain's orders to abolish slavery for 75 years. Australia, not so much. Australian slave traders drowned slaves rather than give them their freedom. It's pretty sad. Australia was full of white slaves at one time, but then turned to Aboriginals, and they were treated very badly. It took until 1901 to finally force Australia to set their slaves free. That's kind of sad. That's a sad story. Makes me think less of the Australians now. Mauritania still has slavery. An African country still has slaves. The lighter-skinned Berber people of Mauritania are slave owners, while the darker-skinned people called the Black Moors are slaves. An Islamic country. It is one of the last great strongholds of slavery in the world. So I think Mr. Walcott should do some more studying about black culture and how slavery actually started. And he can do that by watching Thomas Sowell. This guy tells it like it is. He's a black man, doesn't pull any punches. And that guy could learn a lot from him. Instead of blaming everything on us, on whites. The Queen didn't own any slaves. The royal family never really owned a lot of slaves in its history. Certainly the Windsors never did. Queen Victoria as well probably never owned any slaves. And the fact that the royal family and the British Empire used their influence to get rid of it. They did it wrong, they corrected the wrong. Yeah, they're hammered for colonialism and slavery. Colonialism wasn't always great, no, obviously. And slavery is never good. But at the same time, you can't blame them for the problems of the world. It was a worldwide thing. The scale was massive, but we really don't know the numbers of anywhere else. But I think it's time for Africa to get itself out of its own mess. Stop blaming colonialism for all their problems and fix them. Give their balls a tug and get down to it. They got rich off the slave trade too. They sold these slaves. Where's all that money now? Their rulers pissed it away. Anyway, Canadians out there, let me know what you guys think of the whole issue of African reparations for slavery that ended like almost 200 years ago. Leave comments in the comments section. Until next time, this has been the Great White North Report.